Thanks everyone for joining to our 6th Tech Talk, I think. I'm really excited that Roberto agreed to join us here today. So thanks a lot. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that all of us here in Fairbanks are in the traditional lands of the Lower Tanana Dene, who have been stewards of this land for millennia. And in light of this presentation today, and of course, because in light of the lecture series at large, I would especially like to acknowledge the incredible importance and the critical value of traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And the fact that, I guess, for decades and centuries, this knowledge, and especially the people that have held this knowledge and still hold this knowledge, have not always been treated justly. And I would also like to acknowledge that there has been a lot of progress, and progress is still being made, but there remains a lot to be done still. And with this, I am, very, very excited and very happy that Roberto Delgado agreed to join us here today and to have this conversation with us. He's the program director of the Arctic Observing Network from NSF. He has different program responsibilities, including the Arctic Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grants Program, the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, and many others. And he will give a more in-depth introduction of himself in a minute, so I'll keep it short. And I thank everyone for joining. And Roberto, thanks for being here with us today. And I hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone giving up their time to join us today, this early afternoon for you all in Alaska. I'll also like to make a secondary land acknowledgement, as I am presently on Anacostan and Piscataway lands at the confluence of the Anacostia and Potomac Rivers, also known as the District of Columbia. So this afternoon, I want to spend a little time sharing a little bit more about myself, background and context, including sort of my personal history with traditional ecological knowledge, and then shift gears to tell you more about different initiatives, including some funding opportunities that the National Science Foundation offers and supports in an effort to further strengthen collaborations with Arctic residents, both local and Indigenous communities. So I do have a few slides to share, and hopefully this will work out as it did during our rehearsal earlier. And I hope folks can see my title slide there. So yes, I am currently at the National Science Foundation. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Roberto Delgado, and while I was born, principally educated, and largely socialized in the United States, my parents, Roberto and Betty, are from Ecuador, which is a small country in South America. I'll use this world map as a reference point. So the lowest yellow dot on the left is where Ecuador is here. On my mom's side, I have mixed Asian and Spanish ancestry. So these are the two other yellow circles here. You can see one in Spain and one in southern China. And on my dad's side, I have ancestry from an ethnic group known as the Kanyari, which were peoples who largely have a history from the central highlands of Ecuador and the Andes. Over history, they were overtaken by the Inca and Spanish, and so many of the descendants are mixed, including my paternal family. When I was young, my father was in the US Army, and that also meant we moved around a lot, including spent time in Western Europe, in the deep south of the United States, places like Alabama, and also parts of South America before we ended up settling in Southern California, in a city now known as Los Angeles or LA, which means from an early age, I had experience with different cultures and languages and belief systems. And in college, I took an interest in human variation, evolutionary biology, and behavioral ecology, which ultimately led to graduate school at the time in North Carolina, studying great apes in the wild. There's, I don't know if folks can see in the middle of Central Africa, there's a picture of a bonobo or a pygmy chimpanzee. I had a failed attempt at studying great apes there, but then was successful in completing a research dissertation on orangutans in Southeast Asia. There's a little male orangutan on the far right side of the world map here. Followed by my first professorship in New York City at Hunter College, part of the City University of New York University. And then I returned to Los Angeles a few years later at the University of Southern California while continuing research fieldwork in Africa, Southeast Asia, and also adding some new field schools where I taught research methods and field methods and research design, excuse me, throughout sites in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. So this is the last circle here on the map. But throughout my graduate school and early academic years, as I found myself in foreign lands, Southeast Asia, East Africa, Central America, and elsewhere, I found myself learning and benefiting from traditional and sometimes indigenous knowledge, particularly with my interest in environmental conservation, wildlife biology, and also just behavioral ecology. I spent a lot of time working in and around local villages on the islands of Sumatra and Borneo in Indonesia. The picture on the top left is not from a wild research site, but rather from a rehabilitation center. Some colleagues of mine have begun rehabilitating and reintroducing orangutans into protected areas, and they do a nice job of post-release monitoring. So I've taken advantage of one of their photographs. In the lower half of the slide is based on some time in Zanzibar, which is an archipelago off the coast of East Africa, and specifically Tanzania. Initially, my interest was working with red colobus monkeys here on the lower left, holding a coconut, but then shifting to some activities with local communities on the island. This also occurred in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And based on these experiences and interactions, I got to a point in my research career where I was more interested in conservation and development challenges than largely, in my case, esoteric research. I mean, only so many people can care about the function of adult male orangutan vocalizations on mating strategies and social systems. So I learned to work with local and sometimes indigenous communities on issues related, initially at least largely related to protected areas management, including helping to establish a forest reserve in Borneo, as well as developing and establishing a national park in Zanzibar. The notes on the slide just indicate some of the types of activities that were really driven by meaningful engagement with local communities, including monitoring and research protocols, and to the extent possible, implementing integrated conservation and development activities. That was a large part of my work in Indonesia. Then when I did some work in East Africa, we had even further engagement and dialogues regarding co-management and establishing local conservation councils even, as well as with the help of some international development agencies, designing and implementing different microfinance schemes and sustainable livelihoods that were non-extractive. So instead of cutting down forest, where primates like red colobus monkeys and orangutans subsist on, really try to develop alternative livelihoods that were not too destructive to the local habitats. In both my cases, these were tropical lowland rainforests. In any case, a lot of this is to say that, first of all, I couldn't and didn't do any of this alone. That I think is very clear. Not only working with, for example, other academic collaborators, nonprofit organizations, both based locally within Indonesia and in Tanzania, as well as with international nonprofit organizations. Certainly government agencies were important part of financial support and I want to say will even to really apply some of these efforts. But clearly, and perhaps most importantly, local and sometimes indigenous partners were really the most critical drivers of any positive outcomes that we were able to accomplish. I can certainly spend hours and perhaps even offer semester-long courses on the previous research and conservation activities, both in Indonesia and Tanzania. But again, my point for sharing some of this narrative is that I want to establish, that my past experience helped to instill in me a fundamental understanding, value, and respect for working with a diverse range of knowledge holders. And so that, even though my current role is very different in the sense of now I serve as a federal program officer, I work for a donor agency, it's not to say that I don't dismiss the value of this type of continued engagement. So to turn things back to the present day, in 2013, so almost 8 years ago now, I initially came to the National Science Foundation as a science technology policy fellow. At the time, I was an academic researcher. I was in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California. But I was, again, in a transition phase between that basic academic research into more applied development conservation interests at the time. As fate would have it, when I came to Washington in 2013, I did not end up working on tropical biodiversity conservation and that type of international development assistance, but rather I ended up in Arctic social sciences, which was actually an incredible opportunity for me, as well as a bit of a challenge given sort of the very different type of landscape and my relative minimal experience having not previously traveled to or worked or studied anything about the Arctic. But through my fellowship at the National Science Foundation and polar programs, and specifically with the Arctic Social Sciences Program, as well as through engagement with the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, or IARPC, I'll return to that towards the end of my remarks, as well as the Intergovernmental Arctic Council, a number of themes that have increasingly become important over the 7-8 years that I've now worked in this science policy landscape have included food security, traditional ecological knowledge, as well as research ethics. Following my fellowship, I remained in Washington. I resigned my academic appointment. I moved to the National Institutes of Health for a number of years, and this coincided with the ascendancy of the United States as the chair of the Arctic Council. And I dedicated a little bit over 3 years to public health initiatives focused on mental health and suicide prevention, including among Arctic indigenous communities. In part, I helped coordinate and lead an initiative called Rising Sun, which stands for Reducing the Incidence of Suicide in Indigenous Groups, Strengths United Through Networks. And the ultimate outcome of that effort was an online toolkit, which provided consensus-based, community-driven outcomes to help evaluate suicide prevention interventions. I remain engaged with NSF through the interagency group, IARPC, as well as through Arctic Council activities. In 2018, at the end of the summer, about August, I had an opportunity to return to the Office of Polar Programs, where I now direct the Arctic Observing Network, or AON program. And I continue engaged in interagency activities, including U.S. Arctic Observing Network, an international sustained Arctic Observing Network, and as was described earlier, a number of different programmatic responsibilities within the foundation, including long-term ecological research, the doctoral dissertation research improvement grant within Arctic, as well as Navigating the New Arctic Big Idea, or NNA, which I'll also be speaking to a little bit later. So over the past year, to switch gears now to a little bit more about kind of the core of my talk and the main themes of the TEK Talks, traditional ecological knowledge, as well as broadening diversity, equity, inclusion. Clearly over the past year, these topics, diversity, equity, inclusion, and even racial justice really have become front and center topics across the nation. And that's no different for the National Science Foundation. As of June last year, some of you may be aware that there was a new director appointed, Sethuraman Panchanathan, or Panch, as he likes to be called, pictured on the current slide, was confirmed by the Senate and came on to lead NSF for the next 6 years. Clearly, he came in under pandemic times and an economic crisis, and plus many protests around the country around racial justice. And so, needless to say, it was a challenging period and transition for him to come in. But early on, Director Panch, really laid out a framework for his vision of NSF's direction in the coming years under his tenure. He's been doing a lot of outreach, attending professional conferences and other large-scale national and international meetings. Some of you may have heard him speak or read some press, but I've outlined or really summarized the three main pillars for his vision moving forward. I won't have time to speak to all of these, but we'll try to focus on the second one, which is ensuring inclusivity. And just for completeness, the other ones are advancing research into the future, as well as continuing global leadership in science and engineering. But that second one, ensuring inclusivity, has been really, really a driving force for a number of activities, both across the foundation, among different directorates here at the National Science Foundation and within specific funding programs. So, when I read these pillars, I'm like, wow, they sound really great, really great objectives here. But then one has to question, well, what do they mean exactly, and how are these pillars translated into sort of tangible, concrete actions, right? So thinking about the NSF mission, which is as a basic research funding agency, both for science, engineering, math, education, to advance national security, societal health, economic well-being. Again, there needs to be a way to take these high-level pillars of a vision and develop program solicitations that would allow a larger field of society, larger range of society to benefit. So thankfully, Ponch came in and inherited a number of programs that were already underway, including NSF Includes, which is one of the 10 big ideas and is described as a comprehensive national initiative to enhance U.S. leadership in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or the STEM fields, but also focused on NSF's commitment to inclusion, diversity, and broadening participation in these fields. Related to that, there are other advisory committees, for example, tied to this effort. Some of you may be familiar with a committee on equal opportunities in science and engineering, or CEOSE, C-E-O-S-E. And that's an external body that advises the NSF on policies and activities that are meant to encourage the foundation in really promoting fuller participation of women, minorities, and persons with disability in the different STEM fields that I've noted. More recently, I'll add that there's also the NSF Advance program, which contributes to NSF's goal of a more diverse and capable science and engineering workforce. And this one is more focused on gender, racial, and ethnic equity. Which I feel is complementary to the Includes program, as well as the types of advice that are given by the advisory committee of CEOSE. I will also say that, before I move on to the next slide, that the director and leadership from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at NSF, or ODI, have stood up a NSF Racial Equity Task Force, which is sort of has twofold purpose. One is internal facing, really reviewing the current state of the NSF workforce, to basically understand why the current NSF workforce, particularly among program directors and among leadership, senior managers, do not accurately reflect the full diversity of the nation. And so clearly there are some systemic issues potentially within agencies in the federal government about hiring practices and recruitment. And so that is, we're taking a look inward first, on one hand, examining what the workforce looks like, what it should look like, and what we can do to change. So there will be some recommendations put forward to senior leadership in the coming months. And the second phase of this equity task force is also to look at the distribution of the awards and grantee institutions, including historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, other minority serving institutions. And again, similarly looking at what is the distribution, the allocation, the demographic of those awardees, and why, if they find, and try to make recommendations to again, improve the diversity and inclusivity of those grantees. I want to pause there just a second, do a check. I see little sort of numbers coming up for chats. Does anything needs to be addressed right now, or can I continue?
You can continue. I was just posting some links.
Okay,
if
wonderful.
anyone has any questions, just post in the chat and we'll monitor it.
So I'm already about halfway through my time, and I want to now turn over to perhaps what is a little more interesting to some of you, including the range of funding opportunities and other types of initiatives that we're working on at the National Science Foundation. And please note that this is not an exhaustive list. NSF, is relatively big, and there are, even within federal agencies, I want to say, some silos, and it's not always easy to learn about what other units are doing. So my remarks will focus on geosciences and Office of Polar Programs and the navigating the Arctic. But please understand that there are probably other areas, other divisions, other programs that are doing comparable, if not similar types of initiatives. Within geosciences, this is just the slide shows a screenshot of the homepage, and I caught it when it was at OPP as opposed to ocean sciences or earth sciences. There are a number of different efforts that have been put forward in recent years, and some that are in sort of in development that unfortunately I can't speak about publicly. But clearly, one of the things that geosciences, and especially Office of Polar Programs, really is keen on is including the diversity, improving the diversity, equity, and inclusion of indigenous populations across the Arctic, for example, and as well as through other underserved groups in the lower 48 as well. So I'll focus primarily the Arctic sciences, and I won't go into too much detail because through other venues, including the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, a number of program officers in the Arctic Sciences section have done webinars and office hours about those opportunities. But I do want to highlight, not only the Arctic research opportunities that has embedded within it the IARPIC Principles for Arctic Research, which is a set of guidelines, ethical guidelines about relationships and communication and respect for indigenous knowledge and environmental stewardship as components that are important for proposal development and proposal submission, certainly. And I'll expand on that a little bit later when we talk more about navigating the new Arctic. So there's the main Arctic research opportunity solicitation that spans several different programs, not just Arctic observing, but also natural sciences, system sciences, and social sciences. And all of these, to one extent or another, are really value, again, where appropriate, the engagement of local and indigenous communities in different efforts. Sometimes that means co-production of knowledge. Other times it means collaborative activities, and either often more increasingly funded through subawards or consultancy services. We're also really impressing upon Western institutions of higher education, major universities and colleges, to really partner with indigenous scholars as co-PIs or even co-leads on proposals as a means of trying to really improve equity among those relationships. Historically, I know that there have been disparities in compensation rates and acknowledgements and credit, and frankly, in some cases, I think exploitation of partners, and that really, there's no place for that anymore. And so, when we evaluate proposals through ad hoc reviews and panel reviews, really, try to provide as much guidance as we can to reviewers and panelists, but also within our internal processes as program directors, and in some cases, like the Navigating the Arctic, a working group really discusses the merits of those types of proposed collaborations in many cases. There's room for letters of support or letters of collaboration now from communities, and rather than having sort of the very short sort of boilerplate that we do for conventional proposals, we do allow for flexibilities and great opportunities to describe the nature of those relationships from non-traditional partners, including from tribal organizations and other indigenous individuals and entities. So there's the Arctic research opportunities, the Arctic Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant, or DDRIG, lots of acronyms in my world, is another effort that we've expanded. Previously, only the social sciences program accepted a dissertation proposal dissertation proposals. We've expanded that to include Arctic observing and system sciences as a means to not penalize students in case their advisors and senior researchers were declined an award. A lot of times students are included into senior proposals, but if those senior proposals aren't recommended for award, that means that students are penalized. So this is a way to mitigate that, as well as to encourage a wider diversity of students to apply for those programs. I'll also mention briefly Dear Colleague Letter, which is not exactly a funding opportunity, but points to existing funding opportunities and highlight particular areas. And so late last year, we published in Arctic Sciences one on community hubs, from which I sort of paraphrase my title here, Strengthening Collaborations Between Arctic Residents and Arctic Researchers. That is a way for the NSF and Polar Programs Section for Arctic Sciences to signal to the research community that we're not just interested in your standard research proposals or your standing or your conventional planning grants or facilities and things like that, or infrastructure, but really thinking about capacity building, science education, outreach, and again, developing meaningful ways of engagement and collaboration with Indigenous communities. So that is an important sort of effort to again signal to the research community and the broader society that the NSF takes concern, is concerned about these issues. So that's the outward facing things. There are a few internal things as well. So most divisions, most programs have an external advisory committee that advises the program. So Polar Programs, for example, has an external committee over the past year, again, in part spurred by the protests for racial justice, as well as increasing value of adopting, promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are some internal Polar, what we call learning activities on diversity and inclusion. We have outside speakers. We're thinking about different trainings, just so that there are complementary activities, things that we're doing internally to be better programmatically, as well as opportunities that we can convey to the broader scientific community. So let me switch now to navigating the new Arctic, or NNA, as we call it. Most people call it now. So navigating the new Arctic is another of those NSF big ideas. This one is largely driven by convergence research approaches, which is sort of a step ahead of, or a step beyond multidisciplinary, but really trans and integrative, focus around the intersection of the natural environment, the built environment, social systems, in a number of different focus areas. There are a number of major goals, really keen on certainly increasing our understanding about the changing Arctic, but also educational goals, certainly enhancing research communities, and a number of others that we can get into additional detail later. We are now in the third year of a projected 5-year initial investment, including development of an evaluation process for the program. And most recently today, there was the community office announced publicly. The notice of award went out for the community office that also will likely be an important partner with NSF in moving forward some of these important initiatives. Navigating New Arctic focuses on both research and planning. The previous 2 solicitations, we've awarded close to 40 different awards. Many of them are multi-institutional collaborative projects. This year, we've added a 3rd track, which we call a collaboratory track, which is intended to be a larger scale, larger scope effort beyond what some of you may be familiar with research coordination networks or research networking activities, really taking a higher level approach, expected to be multi-institutional. Many different ideas are being I think, developed for our March 5th deadline. And we're very excited to be able to receive some of those proposals coming in for our review process over the coming months. And hopefully we'll see some exciting new science that is beyond sort of just convergence research or just planning, but also larger scale collaborations, not necessarily infrastructure building, but really enhancing networks plus research plus some of the other creative ideas that teams are putting forward. So again, I'm going to keep these types of overviews relatively brief. I can answer questions about these solicitations, later in the hour or separately. What I think is also important to note is that while I am here largely trying to tout and praise what I think are some of the good things that NSF has been doing or is continuing to do or plans to do, clearly we are not, I think, meeting everybody's expectations. Some of you may be aware, this letter was made, a letter from different groups from the Bering Strait region was submitted to the National Science Foundation last March. This is just the top half of the letter. So groups from the Bering Strait region wrote a very, I think, good, comprehensive letter raising a number of concerns regarding NSF's NNA program, the Navigating Arctic program, laying out some grievances, some missteps, I think, both by NSF and perhaps by some of the researchers that are supported by NSF, but also at the same time offering some recommendations, which I think is a highly, highly productive way of carrying forward these discussions. So NSF, I can say that NSF has acknowledged and responded. There has not yet been a public response to this letter, but there has been communication with the undersigners of the letter to begin having the types of dialogues that can address some of these concerns and potentially act on some of those recommendations. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all those recommendations or all the concerns. Again, this letter has been made publicly available previously. But beyond that, and unfortunately, part of the challenge in responding and really enabling concrete actions has been undermined, I'd say, by the pandemic, the inability to meet face-to-face, to travel to the north, or to invite some of the signatories of this letter to our headquarters in Alexandria in order to have these further discussions. But it's not to say that nothing is being done. In part, the Dear Colleague letter that I mentioned earlier was part of that risk, was I won't say a direct response, but already in the works in trying to address some of the concerns raised in the letter. And a large of it is about sort of the poor ways, the incomplete ways in which some researchers are reaching out when they want to seek collaborations with Indigenous organizations and partners, plus maybe some of the processes that, unfortunately, as a federal agency, we have to comply with. And so, again, there are early steps being taken, and as anything, at least with the federal government, nothing's going to change overnight. And so we are very receptive to some of the concerns. Others are beyond, I think, the scope of what NSF can do as an individual federal funding agency, and really needs to be discussed from a whole of government approach. Working through the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee is one way that we also hope to address some of these concerns. I'll speak to that as well, just briefly, and then try to allow plenty of time for conversation and some questions. But for example, through the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, we are developing the next 5-year Arctic Research Plan. NSF is the chair of the committee, and so plays a leading role. There are a number of program officers, including myself, just outed myself, helping to develop that draft. But really also having a strong, though limited because of the pandemic, engagement strategy for soliciting input and responding to comments into that draft plan. By next month, there should be a draft plan again available for public comment, which we will try to disseminate and have a series of webinars and probably radio shows and Facebook postings and a wide range of strategies. One of the things that I can share is that unlike the previous two iterations of the Arctic Research Plan, there's been much greater effort in bringing in Indigenous perspectives and voices. The plan coordinator, in fact, is Indigenous scholar. IARPC has also recently hired an Indigenous engagement specialist who is of Indigenous ancestry to help with our strategies in terms of soliciting public input into the plan. And there are also some discussions about hiring or creating a new permanent position within the interagency that would be right now, I think the working title is something Indigenous Community Coordinator. And so, and that's something that we're lacking as well at NSF, I would say. Last month, a number of us on the working group for the Navigating the Arctic were part of an office hours about the current solicitation. And one of the questions I recall was, is there, and so we highlighted the fact that NNA is a cross-foundation effort. People from geosciences, from social behavioral economics, from engineering, from education, from biology, et cetera. And someone asked during the discussion period whether or not there was an Indigenous program officer. And there isn't. Right now, there isn't one. And if you look across the foundation, I can't think of one, and not that I know everybody in the foundation, but if they are Indigenous program officers, they are, I think, under the radar and perhaps not as involved in some of these other initiatives that, for a variety of reasons, whether it's workload and other responsibilities, et cetera. I think there are some in our tribal colleges and universities program or TCUP, but they're, again, very focused on that particular initiative and may not have the bandwidth to address some of these larger foundation-wide concerns. In any case, again, there's a lot of work to be done. I think recommendations from the Racial Equity Task Force will really bring a lot of that to light. And we will work to respond to the extent that we can. Looking at the time, just one last comment. I'll say that in addition to this initial letter from the Bering Strait groups in the Bering Strait, just last week we received an allyship letter. I think a number of folks on this call were signatories on that as well, which basically reiterated some of these concerns and the very important need for NSF to respond, which on the whole I agree with. I think there are some very valid points. There are certain things certainly that NSF can do, or potentially can do. There are other things that NSF may not be able to do in light of current federal policies and regulations. But I think, again, working through the interagency group, having more dialogues, hopefully there will be a time again in the not too distant future where in-person meetings and that type of relationship building can be fostered and strengthened, will really lead to better outcomes like the ones envisioned both by groups from who wrote the letters to NSF, as well as to many within the foundation who have similar viewpoints. So I'll leave it at that. I think I want to really hear from all of you, or as many of you as I can within the next 20 minutes or so. I can stay a little bit after the hour, and I'll give it back to our hosts who can help to facilitate the discussion and the questions. My last slide is just my phone number and emails. I have my personal account email, of course, but also if there are things that you want to know or understand about Navigating the Arctic, there is an alias nna@nsf.gov. And coincidentally, I manage that alias as well. So can never be too sure.
Thank you, Roberto. So I haven't got any questions yet. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. Oh, here is one question. Oh, so this one's about NSF Fastlane. Is there training to educate people on how it's application system, or will you be making a system that's more user-friendly?
So my understanding is that we are actually going to be phasing out Fastlane in the coming months. In fact, proposals submitted to the new Navigating the New Arctic solicitation are no longer accepted via Fastlane. We are recommending research.gov and I believe grants.gov can also be used. So unfortunately, I haven't been on the proposal writing side in a number of years now, and I used to do Fastlane. I don't know the functionality or how user-friendly research.gov or grants.gov are. But normally, so in the past, again, when there would be NSF grant writing conferences, we would have staff from our budget and finance office, our division of grants and agreements, who would go and hold these conferences, and regional, I think they go to Boston, they go to Seattle. I don't know if they've gone to Alaska in the past. I'm sure, I would hope they have, but they've gone to places around the country to introduce the system, provide some initial training about the types of documentation that is necessary. A lot of it is done through sponsored research offices, or we call the authorized organizational representatives. Most institutions or organizations supporting or submitting proposals have kind of that administrative person. For tribal organizations, I don't know the full details of how that works, but I suspect there might be one or two individuals who are the ones responsible for doing the submissions, the reporting, and any other administrative requests or notifications.
Thank you. I think Andy Mahoney wants to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Roberto, for your talk. I got to say, it's deeply heartening to hear all of the diversity and inclusivity efforts that NSF has to sort of see them all laid out in one go. I found that really heartening. And in particular, those relevant to OPP and the NNA program. The possibility of an Indigenous Scholar Program Officer for, I wasn't sure if that was for NNA or OPP wide. That's really exciting opportunity. I do wonder how compatible that is with Indigenous experts who retain a sort of, who still want to sort of live in their communities and retain a more their typical connection with their community. Do you see any other ways to incorporate Indigenous viewpoints and Indigenous knowledge sort of at the program level that don't necessarily perhaps involve bringing somebody to DC in a position like that?
Yeah, no, that's something worth discussing. So initially, I raised it because it was a question that was posed to the NNA working group a few weeks ago. But we've had similar discussions within Polar Program, specifically Arctic Sciences. And so we are actually looking for a part-time rotator, what we call an IPA, for both help with the AON program, Arctic Observer Network, as well as natural sciences. And ideally, we would love to have either, it doesn't have to be a PhD, but an Indigenous knowledge holder or Indigenous scholar to be able to come and work within the NSF context. We primarily are most familiar with this rotator position, this part-time, having folks come in for 1 to 3 year period to help manage a program, to develop new solicitations, new initiatives, work across the foundation or other efforts. But we're also, given the pandemic situation, I think evaluating what our how our work will look like coming forward. At some point we will be past this pandemic, hopefully sooner than later. But folks have really taken to heart that many of us, I live locally to across the river from the NSF building. I haven't been there in almost a year now. Others live in Virginia or Maryland. Others have moved, including not just the rotators, but permanent program staff have moved to other parts of the country, because we've been able to demonstrate we can work effectively, assuming you have a good internet connection, of course, work effectively to advance, to review proposals and do approve no cost extensions, et cetera, et cetera. It's certainly, I think, within the realm of possibility of having additional I'll say, it depends on how folks are recruited, whether they are specific within to program folks. Some divisions and have what they're called experts, for example, that are they're assigned essentially as contractors to help out with particular tasking or particular efforts that a given director or initiative is interested in advancing. So, I mean, if I were part of NSF leadership, I would certainly, take that under serious consideration to allow whether it's a program director or an expert knowledge holder, for example, to work remotely to remain engaged with their local communities. So I don't think it's out of the question. I think it's not very common throughout the NSF. And so, although again, we are really trying to reconfigure how work life will go back. I can't imagine that the entire foundation will be 100% on site at the building like we were before. And so I think that's an important thing to continue discussing.
Thanks, Roberto. I appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question from Rachel. I was wondering what you think NSF could play in supporting Indigenous scholars, whether we are working in Indigenous knowledge, science, both, engage in different aspects of how science/knowledge is shared in academics. One space is publications. Typically publications and decision therein come from a Western construct, such as peer review, authorship, etc. Can we move these more typical Western approaches to be more open to Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I'd like to think so, but it may take a while. This is actually something very similar that I experienced when I was still at the NIH before in between my fellowship and returning as a permanent program officer at the NSF. I was in the National Institute of Mental Health, and I became chief of rural mental health, but also still involved in global, Arctic, and essentially in tribal health research as well, where there is a tribal health research coordinating committee. And in fact, I was pleasantly surprised to learn that NIH has an external tribal advisory committee. NSF doesn't have anything like that. But to get to, that's just a little context, but understanding, even though there were some tribal specific funding opportunities within the NIH, there were sometimes concerns in the evaluation process because some of the expertise was not vetted through Western peer-reviewed publications, for example, or certain individuals didn't have that terminal education degree. And I learned, at the time, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, for example, they kept a library of protocols, basically, of outcomes and practices. But they were very, very resistant to any that were sort of tribal or indigenous knowledge only. That wasn't, that didn't fulfill certain thresholds, at least identified by the Health and Human Services Department at the time. So I think that there is certainly a wider role for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders to contribute to NSF mission, but it may take some time to sort of change the tone, the mentality, or even the outlook, especially among senior leaders and senior managers, in terms of understanding the equivalent value of those, those different types of expertise and knowledge that are not, codified in Western peer-reviewed publications or other conventional or some, the types of indicators or the types of metrics that have been used thus far. So again, with everything, I think that there's certainly room for that. There's good opportunity. It's going to take time. We need more people with the right mindset to accept and to promote those types of approaches.
All right, so we have another from Jesse. I see planning grants to fund travel, relationship building, and time for gathering to discuss community needs with Indigenous leaders as a great shift towards more equitable and meaningful collaboration with Indigenous communities. I wonder if a greater proportion of program funding will be available in the future, specifically to build relationships. And then there is kind of an add-on, another question I got about in what ways does NSF provide or support capacity building for Western-based scientists to engage successfully with Indigenous communities in the Arctic? So I feel like those are pretty similar. So.
Yeah, so let me think about that. So yeah, there's two sort of themes there. One being about the availability of funds, program funds to support capacity building and that type of meaningful engagement. You know, so NSF, I guess one other thing I'd like to clarify also is perhaps a misconception by some on the role of NSF. Unlike some other mission agencies that conduct research in the Arctic, you know, name NASA, NOAA, Office of Naval Research, a number of DOI agencies like the Geological Survey and Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service. We are, I want to say we NSF are a step removed in the sense that we don't have NSF scientists in the field. We have NSF supported, you know, institutions and PIs. And so that to a certain extent, you know, is sometimes a hindrance in what we can, I won't say force, but we can encourage or persuade our PIs to do. Certainly, you know, we have terms and conditions of awards and their types of engagement. And NSF tries to be a bottom-up agency in the sense that we are receptive to a wide range of ideas and proposals. You know, so the fact that we have planning grants, for example, and some of our solicitations, the fact that we are able to publish this Dear Colleague letter that is focusing on community hubs and capacity building and science education and outreach, and that type of activity as opposed to your basic research gives us a little bit of flexibility, but we also have to rely with researchers and communities as partners to put those ideas forward, and members, you know, through our review process, which is largely the community. You know, it's peer review. It is other individuals in the scientific community who are evaluating, providing recommendations to us as program directors on whether or not a proposal is meritorious in terms of their intellectual merits and broader impacts. And so, you know, for the future, I can see certainly if there is a real push from the scientific community and they say this is a need, this is of utmost importance, that can be communicated across different divisions of NSF where for future years there can be, so we don't set aside monies necessarily, we have program funds for each program, and then evaluate proposals, you know, to make recommendations for. But there can be some initiatives potentially developed to focus on this type of activity that complements the research, the planning and the infrastructures, et cetera. So, so yeah, I think there can be, again, NSF I don't think would necessarily act on its own volition unless there are strong pushes, including by, you know, different organizations and individuals who are, so letters like the allyship letter and the letter from the Bering Strait are valuable to put forward, to support, and to really, you know, continue urging agencies like NSF and others that support research and conduct research in the Arctic to move forward. Now I've forgotten the second part. It was about
Whether NSF provide support or building capacity for Western-based scientists to engage successfully in Arctic communities, and then a follow-up to, okay, yeah. I think building capacity sense too of yes, a little bit training scientists.
So the short answer is no, not directly, but we are happy to support grantee institutions who are willing to step up and take on some of those roles. So for many years, for example, Office of Polar Programs and Arctic Sciences has supported ARCUS, the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States. And over and coincidentally, I'm the managing program director for that current cooperative agreement. In the current award, there are activities associated with community engagement, outreach, and in some cases, helping, sort of facilitate the types of interactions that many of us want to see. So it's not NSF directly, but working through outside organizations, including ARCIS, others. Most recently, we have now the new community office for NNA. I think they're going to be a very strong partner. And the fact that these are cooperative agreements rather than straight grants means that there is greater interaction between NSF and those grantees. And so instead of, typical research proposal comes in, we say it's great, fine, we give you the money, do what you want. With a cooperative agreement, there is ongoing dialogue as to the direction. ARCIS has objectives, the new community office has objectives, but NSF can help guide or provide some parameters as to how to, we're not going to tell you how to do things, but we want to say, hey, this is what we'd like to achieve, and we will be partners in those efforts going forward. So yeah, we really depend on the scientific community and different organizations out there to put in their best ideas to help support the scientific community through capacity building, training, science communication, and other activities.
Thank you. We're almost at the hour. Do you have time to go over?
Yes, I can stay a little bit longer.
And so just as people start shifting out,
Sure.
the next week Tech Talk is with Dr. Daryl Reno, a recent PhD from Purdue. He'll be talking about Indigenous research framework in multiple contexts. And so those particularly interested in geoscience education should attend. He has requested that it not be recorded. So unfortunately you have to come and attend. It should be a great presentation. I've seen his presentations before and they're super interesting. Okay, so then I'll move on to the next question. Oh, and there's an evaluation I posted and I'll email it out later today too. So kind of adding on to what we've been talking about, is there good examples of NSF research kind of along these lines of what she wrote exactly, successful NSF research / Indigenous / community projects that you might be willing to share as an example?
Yeah, I mean, there are different types, really. Again, I manage a small portfolio within Aon, and I manage a subset of the NNA awards. I think there have been a couple over the past year. For example, the Indigenous Observing Network, or ION, that is led by the Yukon Watershed Group, Yukon River Watershed Intertribal Group, is one that has been effective. A couple of NNA awards recently, including an Arctic Rivers project out of Colorado, is one that I'm really excited about. The Active Aloka Awards, which entail a lot of issues around Indigenous data sovereignty, are really key. There are a whole slew within Arctic social sciences, which I don't know the full the full collection there, but including, well, actually last week you had a couple examples that were in part funded through NSF as well, not just the NRT, but also the salmon management, Indigenous salmon management project. So yeah, there are a handful, mostly within Arctic social sciences, a few within NNA, and several of the other Arctic programs. I can, if I don't have the full list in my head, you can go to the NNA Awards Abstract website for additional information, or email me separately, and I can certainly provide a short list maybe.
And so we have a comment kind of also been what we've been talking about. This one's from Amy Topcock. Shifting the focus of Indigenous knowledge produced by Indigenous scholars instead of those who are not Indigenous to be experts on Indigenous knowledge, it would be a paradigm shift to those in power, but also important to elevate Indigenous knowledge as equal to other knowledge systems from the start. Is there anything that's more of a comment than a question?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's an excellent way to do that. Yeah, and another conversation I was having earlier today at NSF within Arctic Sciences, in terms of we're trying to again recruit to the extent possible, again, there can be limited pool of individuals who have the interest to work with NSF in type of programmatic capacity. And it's not like we non-Indigenous program staff at NSF, there should be some initiative on our part as well, and not just depend on Indigenous peoples to tell us what we're doing wrong and how to do things right, but also again our own motivations to work appropriately and engage in meaningful types of dialogues and efforts, including through I think one of the concerns was in developing the program solicitation for NNA, that there was no formal consultation, for example, through some of the ideas or just something that NSF came up with. And I think there are some valid concerns regarding the way in which NSF operates versus the way NIH operates or other federal agencies that conduct research. I've only recently learned that NSF has a tribal liaison who is sort of the point person for tribal consultations when those are appropriate and required. And so I think that, as I'm learning and maturing more about how NSF operates, even after 2 years, I'm still learning things. Having these resources, participate and engage and communicate what their roles are will ultimately lead to some mutually beneficial outcomes.
And then we had another question kind of related to the rotator position.
Yes.
It would be interesting to have either or both faculty sabbatical and graduate student intern roles as advisors and expert at NSF. So the idea that they'd stay at their university and help craft programs from the university instead of fully going to NSF for a period of time.
No, I think there are potential different models. I think one challenge there is that sort of poses a distinct advantage to that particular institution or potential conflicts. But there are probably ways around that, either through contractor position, these science assistant positions, or these expert positions, where we can try to mitigate some of those or manage some of those potential conflicts or advantages for certain organizations or others. But I think that, to solve some of these concerns, that have long lasting, some of these are decades, if not centuries old concerns, right? That we have to have, as NSF, we as the US government have to have creative ways of addressing some of these issues. And I think the tone has certainly shifted. I started in Arctic science policy and program management about 7 years ago, and I've seen changes. Positive changes for the most part. They're not maybe as fast as I would have liked or others may appreciate, but slowly but surely we are, I think, making some important advances. We won't be able to please everybody all the time, and it will take probably a generation or two before we reach, a new steady state, a new equilibrium regarding partnerships and collaborations and sort of justice in race and equity.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions I have. I don't know, you haven't had any, Annika. And also, if you're on the phone, it's *6 to unmute if you are stuck that way. Any last questions? No? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, but we can hang out in case someone didn't want to ask their question on the recording.